Welcome to the Operational Technology Cybersecurity Podcast. This podcast focuses on the rapidly growing and often misunderstood intersection of information technology and industrial process. What's going on, everybody? Derek here. I want to start this episode off today by talking about cooking. Now, I'm from the South, and I love Southern cooking. And one of the things that makes Southern cooking so good is having a rich base. For those of you that know and love Cajun food, you know the value of that base, also known as the roux. The roux is where the flavors and fats and oils and spices all come together to give a dish its foundation and flavor. So what I'm hoping to do with today's episode is make something of a safety and compliance roux that forms the foundation of industrial culture. I know, a safety and compliance roux sounds way less appetizing than a crawfish etouffee roux, but this isn't a cooking show. And safety and compliance are things that are paramount for any industrial organization. So just like etouffee, it's something that needs to be appreciated from the roux level upwards. And when you look at safety from a business perspective, and let's be real, there's a tension. There's a tension between safety and profitability. And this tension has played a big part in the evolution of safety throughout our industry. It's playing out right now with cybersecurity. So it is nothing short of awe-inspiring that workplace and process safety has come from the boroughs, up from the rough streets of get out of the way of my business making money, to Rodeo Boulevard of safety being a core tenet for industrial operational success. It's fascinating. And this story of safety ties closely with the story of compliance. And for anyone in cybersecurity, these are the things you want to understand about your industry. Today's guest, Jim Sheldon, will drive this point home with a specific focus on NERC CIP compliance in the electrical distribution industry. So let me summarize it for you like this. I'm going to make the roux with a look at the history of safety in the industrial marketplace and how that story has really shaped safety culture. And Jim is going to be the main course and talk about where the rubber meets the road in safety, compliance, and reliability in cybersecurity through the lens of NERC CIP compliance. So if that sounds like a meal you're interested in audibly consuming, then let's get cooking. From an industrial perspective, the early 1900s is a fascinating chunk of time, what some call the emergence of modern America. During this time, we see the widespread adoption of internal combustion engines, production processes, such as the famous Ford fast moving assembly line, concept of just-in-time and lean manufacturing. We see development of interchangeable parts and mechanisms, and tons of associated inventions like the development of the typewriter and stenotype, things like diode and radars and lead acid and alkaline batteries. We see innovation in air travel and widespread and evolving adoption of the telephone and other types of wire transmission, which ultimately gives us the birth of AT&T, so take that for what it's worth. We see plastics and other refined products hitting the marketplace. Manufacturing during this time becomes the backbone of the United States economy. Unfolding might be a light way to describe it. Exploding. Prior to the workman's comp legislation of 1911, there was literally no concept of safety in the workplace. These backbone industries, these manufacturing facilities, were high-risk workplaces. The facilities were loud, dim, and unsanitary. No bathrooms, no ventilation, no heating or cooling, no hearing protection or any other personal protection. They were unsafe. Machines had literally no safety features, not even guards or shields. People were either poorly trained or completely untrained, working when tired, hungry, hungover, or heck, even drunk. Or maybe even some combination of all three. So needless to say, accidents, injuries, and fatalities were commonplace. And keep in mind, this was all unfolding at a time when 2/3 of the workforce was women and children. I don't think it's an over-exaggeration to say that the progress of this time was forged on the backs of these workers. However, The workmen's comp legislation of 1911 would introduce a new paradigm that changes the game for the average worker. And that paradigm was liability. Under workmen's comp legislation, regardless of fault, the company would pay for injuries occurred on the job site. This was a powerful shift because once the company was compelled by legislation to pay for injuries, it became in the company's best interest to prevent injuries. This is the genesis of safety as a business practice in the industrial marketplace. In the years to follow, workplaces would reduce hazardous physical conditions, shorten working hours, establish a minimum working age, and make improvements in sanitation and overall facility conditions. As the practice of safety developed, so too did the recognition and relationship of safety as a component of profitability. Let me say this another way. Safety had shown itself to be an important element in business profitability because safety itself is integral in maintaining an effective worker. This was something of a light bulb moment that saw safety evolve from a standalone, isolated, necessary evil to an integrated, essential element in planning, design, approach, and yes, even budgeting of business operations. Furthermore, it was understood this had to be a continuous process that required a cooperative effort amongst all the stakeholders, employees, management, suppliers, vendors, regulators, etc. Now let me just pause here for a second. In a quick overview like this, evolution and development can seem simple and obvious, like a straight line. But it wasn't the case then, and it isn't the case now. These things came as a result of fighting the good fight, sometimes literally, and by involving things like strikes, trade wars, unions, political groups, and all sorts of other aspects of social systems. Companies just didn't look at the data and then get on board with spending money to ensure a safe and sanitary work environment. In many cases, they had to be dragged in that direction, kicking and screaming. And the truth is, this evolution, like all evolution, brought about extinction as well. Like we talk about almost every episode, the industrial marketplace is incredibly competitive. Many industrial organizations only make money in the margins, so there was simply no room for spending money on a radical new concept like worker and process safety. So from the perspective of these companies, they were resistant to change as a protection mechanism of their own business models. So needless to say, this dynamic made safety a hard concept to sell. The evolution of safety in the industrial marketplace saw waves of progress, steps forward, and it also saw waves of progress, defeats, stagnations, and even steps backwards. At no point in this quick overview am I trying to diminish or minimize the pain and cost of progress. So these hard-fought battles and their social, economical, and even political implications spurred the development of social and government bodies such as the EPA, the FDA, OSHA, etc., with the overarching mission to be conscious of workplace hazards and promote best practice standards and statutory provisions. These governmental bodies are very much akin to NERC and FERC, which Jim will give us a 101 overview of in just a few minutes. So let me just close by saying this history is what makes the safety culture within the industrial marketplace so important, because it came at a high cost. People suffered and fought to work in safe and sanitary conditions. It's awesome to see safety now as a mature business practice with concepts and models, metrics, frameworks, science, and statistics that drive and tell the safety story. And I can't overstate enough the extreme importance that this principle has played. So it's another one of those moments in the pod where grab a highlighter, underline this section because it's something of importance. And that's the principle that if we ignore safety, we make it harder to achieve business objectives. And this is every bit as true in cyber safety as it is in physical safety. Where we are today with cyber in the industrial marketplace is very similar to where we were with safety in those early days. Struggling to justify the spend, trying to demonstrate the intrinsic value, link the value with the business objectives, not be treated as an isolated, necessary evil, but rather be part of the overarching team and strategy, doing the planning, budgeting, purchasing, building, so on. Implementing practices that are part of a continuous process and cooperative effort with all stakeholders, to a point where cybersecurity is baked into the safety culture and indistinguishable from the other dimensions of critical industrial safety. It all comes down to this. Just as physical safety is integral in maintaining an effective human worker, cyber safety is integral in maintaining effective digital workers. These are the networks and computers that run your mission-critical production systems. And as these things continue to integrate with, and in many cases supplement, the human worker, digital safety and effectiveness will be hinged on cybersecurity. And we need to advocate and push for it just as hard as those who came before us did. So yeah, regardless if we're talking about physical, process, or cyber safety, there is a cost and complexity burden for resilience and reliability. If you want a modern-day COVID-19 example, ask almost any business owner for a profit and loss statement who has tried to adjust their business model for social distancing, quarantine, 25% occupancy, continuous sterilization, etc., etc. I think it'll be safe to say that the increased safety steps has also increased cost. So Jim is going to help us look at this dynamic between compliance, cost, and safety from the viewpoint of NERC CIP compliance. And I think this is perfect because the electrical grid is such a great use case because it's such an essential service to every single one of us. NERC CIP's mandate is to promote the reliability and adequacy of bulk power supply by the electric system. It's large, it's complex, it's burdensome, some might even call it heavy-handed. But however you want to describe it, it's all there because of the criticality of securing and protecting energy infrastructure. So with those factors in place, let me roll out the red carpet for Jim Sheldon. Jim, say hi to the listeners.
Hi, my name is Jim Sheldon, and I'll give you a bit of my background before I begin on NERC CIP 101. I have a Bachelor's of Science in Electrical Engineering, and I went to work for a power company in the Upper Midwest as a telecom engineer, where I designed communications for substations, power plants, wind farms, and other distributed generation. These communication systems covered everything from microwave links on 290-foot towers, spanning 40 miles in the Bakken oil fields, to fiber optic connections that never leave a control room. All kinds of data traverse these connections, protective relaying signals, SCADA commands, plant historical data, and more. These are your typical OT systems that are the focus of this podcast. As an engineer, one of my favorite projects was designing the SCADA systems for remote telecom sites. These systems would monitor alarms such as doors, batteries, AC power, temperature, etc. The generators and other systems could also be controlled remotely through the SCADA system. Around this time, I started hearing about industrial cybersecurity, and this led me to a master's degree in cybersecurity. When I finished the master's program, the IT department offered me a job in OT as a systems administrator. I could have really used Derek's OT explanation in episode 2, as I didn't know what OT was. At first, it was like drinking from the fire hose, so many systems, technologies, and protocols to keep track of. After working for a few years as a systems administrator, I co-founded CIP-Centric to help small utilities with their NERC CIP programs. Our focus is on utilities with small to no IT departments. Between being a sysadmin and a telecom engineer, I have 15 years of experience on OT systems in the power industry. And that's enough about me. NERC CIP. NERC CIP is compliance. Here's the scoop. There's a NERC and a FERC. First, we'll touch on FERC. FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It has the F in it, so I always think feds. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 put FERC in charge of the bulk electric system reliability. The bulk electric system, or BES, typically pronounced BES, is generally infrastructure at 115 kilovolts or greater. FERC hired NERC to be the United States Electric Reliability Organization, or ERO. So now we are at NERC. NERC is a not-for-profit and stands for North American Electric Reliability Corporation. NERC, hired by FERC, plans and develops the CIP standards, which are approved by FERC. NERC hires a regional entity, of which there are 6, to enforce the standards by auditing and recommending fines. CIP is critical infrastructure protection. That's CIP as in CIP. A side note, there are actually 16 sectors of critical infrastructure, such as dams, chemical, emergency services, food and agriculture. These sectors are considered vital to the United States. The bulk electric system, or BES, is part of the energy sector critical infrastructure. So there you have it. FERC hired NERC to create the CIP standards, which are enforced by the regional entity to protect the BES, which is part of the energy sector. Now on to the CIP standards. The main purpose of the CIP standards is to protect the BES from cyber or cyber-related attacks. The CIP standards have been around since 2008, but they had a major version update to version 5 that became effective in July of 2016. There are several CIP standards that cover different domains to protect the BES. At this point in time, June 2020, there are 11. CIP-002-5.1a to CIP-14-2. It may seem like a few standards are missing. That's because CIP-001 is no longer effective, and CIP-12 and CIP-13 are not effective yet. First, here's what the CIP standards are not. They are not security. There is some overlap, don't confuse the two, or you will be severely disappointed. Also remember, the standards development teams list what you need to accomplish, but they don't state how this is to be accomplished. All right, here we go. First, we need to identify what hardware and cyber systems are actually considered part of the BES. This is CIP-002, BES Cyber System Categorization. This is an important standard because if this is interpreted and implemented incorrectly, your entire CIP program may be incorrect. If a cyber system is part of a BES, it is defined as a BES cyber system, or a BCS. You know we're having fun when we start nesting acronyms. This is where we start to get into OT. All of these systems, no matter if they are BES or not, are considered OT systems. There are 3 impact levels of BES assets: low, medium, and high. A small wind farm might be considered a low impact BES asset, and a control center that operates 4,000 megawatts of generation would be a high impact asset. Each level sees an increase in the number of CIP standards and their complexity. A high impact asset will have over 100 CIP requirements. There are too many standards and requirements to cover on this podcast, so I'll briefly cover a few of the other standards. CIP-003, titled Security Management Controls, requires a policy for the other CIP domains, such as training your personnel on cybersecurity, physical security of BCS, i.e. don't have your firewall in a public place, recovery plans, and etc. CIP-5, titled Cybersecurity Electronic Security Perimeter, requires a policy and a process for securing the electronic perimeter of a BCS, requires a jump post when accessing a BCS remotely, requires justification for every firewall rule into your BCS. It even has a section on securing dial-up. Remember, this is an OT system, and we will cover what that means later. One of the most misinterpreted standards is CIP 7-6, titled Cybersecurity System Security Management. This standard really gets into the weeds on hardening a system. However, if you're a professional blue teamer, NERC system hardening requirements won't seem like much. This is what it means when compliance is not security. CIP 7 requires only the required logical ports to be accessible, protect physical ports from use, have a patch management process, use antivirus software, create a baseline, and others. An IT professional only concerned about security might just put a firewall in front of the device, use application whitelisting, or use the existing patch management process and antivirus software. But remember, this is an OT system. We might be on a legacy OS, such as Windows 7, which is now a legacy OS, or XP, or 2000. There probably isn't even a patch management process or antivirus software. Also, the standard requires that any changes to the device baseline must be approved. You can't just install software or disable services willy-nilly. Once you get everything in place, your baselines are set, antivirus is installed, logging is being captured, then you get a small breather. Until 35 days later, where you do it all again. You have to check all of your devices for firmware or other software updates every 35 days for every different type of device. This could be RTUs, HMIs, PCs, PLCs, or protective relays. You get the point. After all this, don't forget about collecting evidence. You must be able to prove you did everything that was required by the standard. Your regional entity will require evidence for specific standards, assets, and devices during an audit. If there's no evidence, it didn't happen. Then you could be fined by NERC. Duke Energy was fined $10 million for CIP violations in 2018. Collecting the evidence is what makes CIP compliance so much more difficult than security. In security, you can patch your systems when an updated software package comes along, or you may wait until it has been vetted. With CIP compliance, you are required to update to the new software if the patch is security related, and you have to do this within 35 days. If you want to wait until it is vetted, you must develop a mitigation plan and have it signed by your CIP senior manager. This is, again, more evidence. This can get really labor intensive and expensive quickly. The potential for mistakes is high, and the cost of errors can be substantial. Fines can be as high as $1 million per day per violation. This is why most companies try to automate some or all of their CIP evidence gathering. Software tools can be used to monitor the baselines on devices and alert on changes, and companies can be hired that check for software updates every 35 days. Some will even vet the software for you. NERC is always revising and updating the standards. New requirements are added, old terms are removed, the compliance target is always moving. That's what makes the standards so difficult. There's a lot of room for interpretation, and the cost of getting it wrong is high. I created a website to filter and search the standards to make them easier to locate information. This can be found at www.nercipstandards.com and is free to use. Hopefully, this short NERC summary will provide some useful information for you and your team. And if you'd like to contact me for a chat about NERC, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.